Good afternoon, biology students. This is Mr. Ebb. I'm going to talk about our first module, which is based on ecology. We'll be doing ecology module 1. This is assignment EPD-1, ecology, population dynamics 1, and it's called global climate. The document in global climate needs to be printed off because you're going to need to be able to fill it in by hand. It will not be easy to do on a computer. So if you have a printer, you're going to want to print it off and then maybe have several different colors that you can write with. If you do not have a printer, then please make a simple drawing of the image that I'm about to share on the screen. So let me share my screen as usual. So this is the image that will come up for EPD-1, global climate, and it's a simple image that you can reproduce on a piece of paper if you can't print it. So let me set a little bit of background to this, a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. So we're in biology. Biology comes from two words: ology, which is the study of, bio, which is life. Biology is the study of life, the study of living things. And our first 4 modules are going to come out of a field of biology called ecology. Ecology is the study of the environment or ecosystems, and it particularly focuses on the interactions within ecosystems. If you could put the Earth under a microscope, we would be zooming all the way out. We would be pulling back all the way, and we're taking a big picture look at Earth and how it functions. Later in the course, we'll zoom all the way in, and we'll take a look at the molecular level, the smallest possible level, at how things work. But we're going to start with a zoom out look, and we're going to look at the big picture first, which is what ecology does. Ecology studies interactions within different ecosystems, interactions within the environment. Some ecologists like to study interactions between, let me back up, there are 2 basic factors in the environment that they study. Generically, one is called biotic factors, the other one is called abiotic factors. Probably things you have heard before. Biotic means living factors, bio, living factors. Abiotic means, A means without, bio, life, without life, non-living factors. So some classic biotic factors would be any type of plant, any type of animal, fungus, bacteria. These are things that we would consider So I'm going to hold the video here just a second. Jumped ahead on me. So I made this video once and the sound didn't work. So that's what we're trying to do here for a second. So anyway, some ecologists like to study the interactions between 2 biotic factors, say 2 populations. For example, it's a famous study in Isle Royale up in Lake Superior in the UP, classic study on how wolves and moose populations affect each other. That's a biotic study on a biotic factor. These folks usually work at the community or population level. Other ecologists like to look at how abiotic and biotic factors interact. How does the non-living world, like the temperature, the weather, the soil conditions, the water conditions, impact life within the ecosystem? That would be people who work at an ecosystem level. And some people like to tinker around with abiotic versus abiotic, such as a climate scientist. They particularly look at how abiotic factors influence other abiotic factors. And that's going to sort of be our topic today, is we're going to look at how one abiotic factor affects another abiotic factor and how that influences the way life is distributed on the Earth. So I'm going to give you some bits and pieces of information first, and then we'll come back to this drawing or this diagram and try to explain some of it to you. So I'm going to a blank page here, and I'm going to draw a couple quick pictures. I'm going to draw the sun, and I'm going to draw the earth. These are real basic pictures. And one of the first things I ask students is, how are these two things related? And ultimately, we determined that the earth is a body that orbits the sun in a sort of an elliptical pattern. And then we asked, well, how long does it take to orbit the sun? And most people quickly said it takes 365 days, which is also known as 1 year. So it takes a full year to go around the sun. So then we came back and we asked them, so how long does it take to make one rotation? How long does it take to make one rotation of Earth? And most people knew that that was going to take about 24 hours or 1 day. So we established the relationship Earth to sun. And then I threw a question at them about seasons. Why do many parts of the earth have 4 seasons? How do we explain the seasons? And I asked them to sketch out a simple diagram of what impacts the seasons. So I'm going to let you think for a moment. What causes the seasons to happen? There's often a debate between the distance from the sun versus the tilt of the earth. Is it the distance from the sun, or is it the tilt of the earth that really determines the seasons? A lot of people still say it's the distance, but it actually is the tilt. So here I've drawn a green imaginary axis through the earth, and the earth is on a tilt. And this red line is the equator. And above the equator, of course, is the northern hemisphere, which we are located at. So I'm going to put an N in there for northern hemisphere. And of course, S is for the southern hemisphere down below. Well, in this particular point, in this particular position, who's closer to the sun? The southern hemisphere is. It's getting a lot of direct sunlight. The northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. It's getting almost no direct sunlight. So what season are we in? As most of that sunlight is going right, skimming over the top of the northern hemisphere. That's going to create very limited energy, very limited temperature. That's going to be winter. And it's going to be our winter season. Because we're not receiving a whole lot of energy from the sun. But if we move the planet around, about a half year later, it has a different tilt. So let me draw it over on the other side. Come on, I'm trying to time this up. So as this thing rotates and turns, the tilt is going to change when we get around to the other side. Now, the axis is tilted the other way. And that puts the northern hemisphere closer to the sun and the southern hemisphere away from the sun. Now we're getting a lot of direct sunlight. And because we're getting a lot of direct sunlight, we have a lot more energy. We have higher temperatures. This, of course, is going to be summer. And now the southern hemisphere is getting almost no direct sunlight, and it's going to be winter. There are in-between times. Up there is going to be what we call fall. That's the fall equinox. And down where I put the other circle, that's spring. That's the spring equinox. We have almost an upright position, and we're receiving intermediate temperatures. So that's how we get the 4 seasons. So we talked about the relationship of Earth to the sun. We talked about the seasons. And then we talked about just, again, drawing the Earth and drawing the sun. What part of the planet gets the most sun? Where does most of the direct sunlight go to? And without too much thinking, most folks could identify that it's the equator. Most direct sunlight goes to the equator. If you start moving away from the equator, And I'm going to redraw the planet here because I realized I didn't put it on much of a tilt. So I'm going to put a axis through here, put my equator in place. But as you go away from the equator, the light bends. It's not a direct angle. That means we're not getting as much energy. And the more bend you have in the light rays, the less energy that you get. So the equator gets a ton of energy. The poles get very little energy. And this has a significant impact on the distribution of ecosystems and the distribution of organisms. There is a correlation going on here. So really, the idea is the more sunlight that you get, the more energy you have available. And the more energy you have available, so here we go, the more sunlight you have, high sunlight, there's going to be more energy available, which means there's going to be more opportunity to produce plants. So plants have lots of energy to grow. And of course, the more plants you have, the more food you have, so the more animals you can support. And the equator ends up being the most biodiverse region on the planet, hundreds of thousands of plants supporting hundreds of thousands of animals. But the closer you get to the poles, the less sunlight you get. And so as you decrease the sunlight, you are going to decrease the amount of energy, which means fewer plants are going to grow, which means you're going to have fewer animals. And if you're talking at the poles, there is almost no plant life at all. The little plant life you have is very short-lived, and the animals that survive at the poles are primarily a small group of meat-eating animals. Very different situation. So when you get to the poles, you get to the least diverse area. Why? Because you have the least amount of energy. But at the equator, you have the most diverse areas. Why? Because you have the most available energy. And it all has to do with the angle of sunlight that the Earth receives. So that is another key feature, another piece of the puzzle that we want you to be familiar with. There is a fourth piece of information. Let's clear the slide here. And that has to do with temperature and air and water molecules. So with the in-class folks, we had them draw a fairly simple T-chart, which I'm going to put on the screen here in just a second. Let me actually expand this a little bit. And so another key factor here, besides the fact that the Earth orbits the sun, besides the fact that there are seasons because of the tilt of the axis, in addition to the fact that the equator receives the most direct sunlight and the poles receive the least, we want to take a look at air. So I made a T-chart, hot versus cold. I told them to use the symbol of a triangle for air and a symbol of a circle for water. And then I asked them to make a very simple diagram that shows how air and water would be arranged in a hot environment versus a cold environment. So we'll give you a moment to think about how you would draw that. How would you distinguish the arrangement in hot environments versus cold environments? So think about it. What happens to air when it heats up? And water. The molecules gain energy, they start moving faster, they start colliding with each other, and they start spreading out and spreading out and spreading out. We call this, they expand. And this is going to create a lot of space between the air molecules. So if I was drawing my diagram for hot air, I would have my air molecules fairly well spaced out. Now what's going to happen different in a cold situation? Things are going to cool down, molecules are going to slow down moving, they're less likely to collide, and everything congregates or condenses close together. So how about water? How does water fit into this? Where can you put more water? Does hot air hold more water, or does cold air hold more water? Ultimately, it's hot air. Hot air has a lot more space in which the water molecules can fit. And so as hot air heats up, water heats up and begins to evaporate, where cold air, there's almost no space for the water molecules. In fact, cold air is sort of like squeezing a wet sponge. The molecules are condensing, you're squeezing, and all the waters are going to get pushed out and create precipitation. That's also going to be a key factor in this whole story between them. So hot air gathers lots of water molecules. The more water molecules it gathers, the more humid it becomes. And as these molecules warm up, what do? They rise. Hot air rises and the water evaporates with it. But cold air does the opposite. Cold air condenses, pushes the water down, and the cold air sinks back down to the ground. That's going to really impact what happens on a global scale. So Earth orbits the sun. 1 year it takes, 1 rotations a day. Many parts of the Earth have seasons because of the tilt. When you're tilting away from the sun, you have less direct sunlight and you are in winter. When you tilt towards the sun, you have more direct sunlight, you're in summer. And there is more direct sunlight at all times on the equator. The equator doesn't have seasons. Why? Because the equator position never really changes. Despite the tilt, it's pretty much the same temperature year-round and things don't change. And again, as we move further and further away from the equator, closer and closer to the poles, the light's on a much sharper angle, less energy is available. And now we know hot air tends to expand and trap water and carries water away from the Earth, and cold air tends to condense and push water out and return it to Earth. So we're going to go back to the diagram, and as we go back to the diagram, you're going to want to add some of the stuff that I add to the diagram. So now I've given you these bits and pieces. Let's see if we can try to tie it together into a story. Okay. So again, I'm trying to retime my comments to a video that I already made. So we should be going back to that diagram in just a second. I'm going to probably pull it forward a little bit. Here we go. So now here's our diagram. So you can see 0 degrees latitude, that's where the equator is. And this is an area where just above and below the equator, what type of environments, ecosystems do you find? Well, just above and below the equator, we have the tropics. We have the tropical regions, and we typically find just above and just below the equator, we find tropical rainforest. So you're going to want to add these labels to your drawing as well. So both above and below the equator. Now as we move away from the equator towards the 30-degree latitude, both north and south, there's a distinct change. We go from a tropical rainforest into a totally different environment, which we call the desert. And again, it's going to happen at both ends. So down in the south, that's northern Australia. And if you don't know, most of northern Australia is desert. Up in the northern hemisphere, this is where the Sahara Desert is in Africa. This is where the Mojave Desert is in North America. Those are the latitudes they exist at. Now, as you move closer to 60 degrees latitude, we get back into some moderate conditions. And these moderate conditions support a series of different types of forest. So right around 60 degrees, we see the temperate forest. Temperate is another word for moderate. It's a moderate forest. This is what we see in lower peninsula of Michigan. Temperate forest, deciduous hardwood trees, trees that lose their leaves, maples, oaks, those types of things. Up in the UP and a little further north, we see coniferous forests. Those are pine trees. And if we go up into northern Minnesota, lower Canada, we go into the taiga and the tundra. And so around 60 degrees, just above and below 60 degrees, we support about 3 different types of forests that are slightly different in their makeup. Same thing is true down in the southern hemisphere, New Zealand, southern Australia, but we don't find a lot of it because down in this region in the south, it's almost all water. There's almost no land. There's New Zealand and Australia, and the rest of it's pretty much water. Up here in the northern hemisphere, we find quite a bit of it because that is where we have Asia, Russia, Europe, North America. up in those regions. And if we go to the far extremes, to the actual poles, this is called the polar region. And of course, we have the Arctic up in the northern hemisphere, which in a moment I should label polar. There we go. And down in the South Antarctic, we have also a polar region. Really no landmass down there. That's almost all ice. There is a landmass in the north, but not so much in the south. And so that's the distribution of different ecosystems, which is totally being dictated by the amount of sunlight that strikes the planet in that location. The amount of sunlight is dictating this. It is dictating where each thing is located. Most energy is available in the middle. That supports the tropical rainforest. The least amount of energy is available at the poles. And polar regions support the least amount of diversity. So why does that happen? Why does sun affect that? Well, now that we're going to tie the idea of direct sunlight to air and water. So at the tropics, at the equator, we have a lot of direct sunlight. So air and water is going to heat up. It's going to warm up, which means it's going to evaporate and rise. And so the air goes upward in both directions and it rises. Now, as that air goes up, and it goes up pretty quickly because there's lots of energy there, it almost immediately cools down because remember, the upper atmosphere gets pretty darn cold. So when it cools down, it's going to be like squeezing that sponge. That cold air is going to condense, and it is going to push a whole lot of rain right around the equator, which is what's going to allow us to create the tropical rainforest. So in a moment, I'm going to write, there we go, it's going to cool down. When the air cools down, the cold air drops, and that pushes all the moisture out and creates rain. Same thing is happening right around 30 degrees latitude in the south. That air cools, drops, and it creates rain. So we have lots of rain falling on both sides of the equator. We have very high energy, very high sunlight, direct sunlight, high temperatures, perfect location for tropical rainforest. And they support hundreds of thousands of species, and they support hundreds of thousands of animals, our most diverse area. Now this cycle is going to repeat itself about 3 more times, and it's going to help explain why we have the breakdown we have. So now that you got that cold air is sunk and it's going along the ground at around 30 degrees latitude. Well, the ground almost always is warmer than the air because it does a better job of absorbing the sunlight. So as that cold air travels along the surface of the 30-degree land, it's going to absorb heat. Well, as that air absorbs heat, what's it going to do? It's going to warm up. And so right around 30 degrees, we're going to see the air warm up. And the warm air is going to attract water. And it's going to pull all the water it can out of that environment and rise up, and it's going to take the water away. As it takes the water away, that dries out the area, thus you have desert. The same thing is happening in the south. I'm not going to draw it for the south, but the same thing's happening in the south. Now, at the equator, that air and water is evaporating so quickly because the energy level is so high, and it cools really rapidly and falls back down almost immediately. You get the tropics. The difference at 30 degrees is that air rises, but it takes a lot longer for it to cool, and it takes a lot longer for it to rise. And so the water doesn't fall until you get a little bit further north. The water is not going to fall right back down at 30 degrees. The water is being stole from the 30-degree latitude, and the water is going to be given to the areas around the 60-degree latitude. So again, eventually that hot air rises, and we are going to cool that air down. Air again is going to drop, and it's going to release rain around the 60-degree latitude. That rain is enough to support the taiga, the conifer, and the temperate forest. It'll be a moderate amount of rain, not near the type of rains you get near the equator. But it creates a very moderate, very mild climate that supports a pretty decent level of biodiversity. The desert is hot and dry, makes it very harsh. It doesn't support a huge diversity. The plants and animals that actually survive at 30 degrees have to be highly specialized. More moderate at 60 degrees. So all the rain that was at 30, all the moisture that was at 30 has been stolen by the atmosphere, and it's been given to the 60 degree. Now the same thing is going to repeat one more time. As we move up towards the taiga and the tundra, the ground it's not very warm, but it's warmer than the air, enough to warm a little bit of air and cause it to rise and take water with it. So the polar regions become quite dry, cold. Think about winter. Winter is very dry. As it gets to the atmosphere in relationship, the atmosphere is colder than it was on the ground around the polar regions. So again, the air is going to cool. And this time it's going to drop precipitation, only this time it's probably going to be more in the form of snow. And so you see this. So what I want you to see is the pattern. I want you to see the pattern. We've got this pattern of warm, cool, warm, cool, warm, cool, which leads to a pattern of rise, sink, rise, sink, rise, sink. So the air is warming and rising, the air is cooling and sinking. The air is warming, the air is cooling and sinking, the air is warming, the air is cooling and sinking. The result of that is water is being pulled out, water is being returned to the planet. Water is being pulled out, water is being returned to the planet. Water is being pulled out, it's being returned to the planet. At the equator, it happens so fast that the water is returned almost exactly to where it's taken from. But as you go more north, the water is usually delivered further back to the earth, further from where it was taken. Thus, you create these dry areas. And the other pattern you hopefully see is at the rainforest. Here we go wet, dry, wet, dry. We're going wet, dry, dry. Okay. Same thing going this way, wet, dry, wet, dry. And that's all because the air is going from rise, cool, rain, rise, cool, rain, rise, cool, snow. It's the pattern I'm most interested in you recognizing or seeing. That is what's determining our climates. That is what's determining our climates. Okay. And so it's no accident that the earth looks this way. And so each of these regions has got different precipitation. Each of these regions have different temperatures. Therefore, each of these regions have led to different adaptations by different organisms, and thus you have many different species in each region. The animals you find in the tropical rainforest are not exactly the same as the animals in the desert. The animals in the desert are not the same as what you'll find in the polar caps. The animals in the desert and the polar caps are not the same animals you find in temperate and coniferous forest. Each region, because the abiotic factors are different, support different biotic plant life. And because you have different biotic plant life, you support different animal life. That's the big picture that I want you to see right now. And so we're going to be getting into an assignment today called population distribution. This is what influences population distribution. The climate conditions totally influence population distribution. So those online folks, you should be, after you complete this task, you should be submitting EPD-1, which is an activity on population distribution, which is due Sunday evening. You should also take a photo of this drawing and upload it under EPD-1 by Sunday as well. So you got two things to do. Take this photo, upload it, and then complete the population distribution assignment on EPD-2. To wrap it up, the other thing is we're going to eventually come back to this because later we're going to talk about human impact, and right now one of the impacts is climate change. We used to call it global warming, which was misleading because that's not the only thing that can happen. Global warming is one thing that could happen. Excess rain, floods, droughts, There's all types of things that can happen. You start messing with the temperature, you're going to change these air patterns. And if you change these air patterns, you're going to change precipitation. And if you change precipitation and air patterns, you're going to change the ocean's currents, which is what drives weather. I mean, heck, take a look at what's going on right now. There's 5 different hurricanes in the Gulf. I don't think I've ever seen that. Usually there's 1 or 2. Look at the fires stretching from California through Oregon into Washington. These are the planet telling us it's not very healthy. It's got some problems. The good news is there are things we can do to fix it. And so I'm not going to get too much into climate change right now. We can debate later how big of a problem is, who caused the problem, how do we fix the problem. Those are all things we can discuss later. But we first have to acknowledge there is a problem, and Earth is telling us there's a problem, and we need to do some things to help bring all these abiotic factors back into line so we can maintain healthy climates. Well, I think that's enough for now. I think we've covered pretty much the main ideas that I had in the original video. And I hope this helps you with your work on EPD-1 and EPD-2. So it's a Friday evening. I'm going to get the heck out of here. Have yourself a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Remember, virtual students, we have meetings on either Monday or Tuesday. Monday is blue classes, that's 5th and 6th, and Tuesday is red classes, that's 2nd and 3rd. Adios.